Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The events we're analyzing today are the D.B. Cooper case and the golden age of skyjacking. I know it might sound weird to refer to a particular time as the golden age of a specific criminal activity, but the late 1960s through the early 1970s represented the high watermark of skyjacking. And by skyjacking, we mean the hijacking of an airliner. That means the unlawful seizure of an aircraft by one or more individuals, usually involving demands for money or to be taken to a specific location. And it always involved threats of violence, either by guns, knives, or explosives. Many of you may have heard of D.B. Cooper. On November 24, 1971, he boarded a Northwest Orient flight from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. He told the flight attendant that he had a bomb and demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. His demands were fulfilled. He got away with the money, was never seen again, and became a legend. Before we talk about the incident involving D.B. Cooper, let me set the scene as to airline security in those days. There was practically none in 1971. This changed shortly thereafter. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, mandated all airlines start screening passengers and their carry-on luggage as of January 5, 1973. This was codified into an actual federal law instead of a regulation from the FAA with the Air Transportation Security Act of 1974. This meant X-ray machines for carry-on luggage and metal detectors for passengers. These security measures started in part because of the D.B. Cooper case and other skyjackings. But even after these laws, things were not taken that seriously, at least as compared to today. Here's an example. I don't remember the exact date, but some point in the 1980s, I was at Kennedy Airport in New York City. I had been in Connecticut visiting my parents, and I was going home to Los Angeles. My mother may have been born in the U.S., but her parents were both from Italy, and she is the stereotypical Italian-American mom. She decided to send me home with a homemade lasagna. How would it last all the way on a coast-to-coast flight? She froze it in a large tinfoil pan. She then wrapped the frozen lasagna in many layers of newspaper to act as insulation. It took up most of my backpack. When I put my backpack through the X-ray machine, the security guard at the airport could see a large rectangular metal object. Obviously, this looked very suspicious. The security guard at JFK asked me what was in the bag. I told him, it's a frozen lasagna. He just stared at me and said nothing. I said, I can't help it. My mom's Italian, and she's sending me home with a homemade frozen lasagna. He continued to stare at me. I guess he thought, who would make this up? He didn't make me take it out of my bag and just waved me through. Although that made my life much easier that day, it shows what the level of security was in the 1980s. Skyjacking became the popular term for hijacking an airplane, although you still hear both terms skyjacking and hijacking. D.B. Cooper was part of the golden age of skyjacking. Airliner hijackings were very rare until the late 1960s. One source I found stated that in 1967 there were only 6 skyjackings worldwide. In 1968, this increased to 29 and almost tripled the following year with 86 skyjackings in 1969. In other sources, I have found slightly different numbers, but these are all close enough for you to get the idea. The numbers remained high for the next few years, but started to come down after 1972. A lot of the decrease was attributable to the security measures that I described earlier. The most notorious skyjackings came much later, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Those were the incidents wherein fanatics commandeered jetliners on September 11, 2001, and flew them into the Pentagon and the World Trade Center towers. Because of those 9/11 attacks, a lot more stringent security measures were instituted, and skyjackings are extremely rare since that time. But getting back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, with all of these skyjacking incidents, why didn't the airlines or the federal government do something? We are all very familiar with the safety procedures currently in effect. There are body scanners, x-ray machines, metal detectors, and random searches to stop people from carrying guns, knives, or bombs onto planes. But the airlines did not want to implement such security measures in the 1960s and early 1970s. It seems insane, but the airlines thought that such safety procedures would be such a hassle that people would not fly. We all know that's ridiculous, since flying now is a fairly miserable experience with smaller seats, no legroom, overbooked flights, and a host of other problems. People fly because there's really no reasonable alternative. Theoretically, my wife and I could take a boat from Los Angeles to Hawaii, or we could drive to the East Coast when we want to visit relatives. But in reality, for most trips of more than, say, 500 miles or 800 kilometers, you need to fly. So instead of taking steps to really stop potential hijackers, the federal government instituted air marshals, sometimes called sky marshals. These were federal law enforcement agents who carried concealed guns onto airplanes. The Air Marshals program began in the early 1960s under President Kennedy. The program was greatly expanded in 1970 because of the number of skyjackings. In October 1970, there were 1,784 agents serving as air marshals in the U.S. The theory was, since nobody knew who they were, that potential hijackers would worry that an air marshal might be on the plane, and so they would not try to hijack that particular flight. By the mid-1970s, the number of agents employed as air marshals greatly diminished because of the widespread use of x-ray machines and metal detectors, as I described earlier, that proved to be much more effective than air marshals. Before I describe the actual hijacking incident, let's take a look at what was going on in 1971. In February, Apollo 14, and a few months later in July, Apollo 15, landed men on the moon. Yes, we had people walking on the moon in 1971. In June 1971, the New York Times started publishing a secret government report on Vietnam, commonly known as the Pentagon Papers. In 1971, East Pakistan declared independence as the new nation of Bangladesh. The 26th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on July 1, 1971. This lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. This was mostly in response to the Vietnam War, as so many people noted that many Americans were old enough to die for their country, yet they could not vote. Now let's discuss the D.B. Cooper incident. November 24, 1971 was the day before Thanksgiving. This was, and is, one of the busiest travel days of the year. During the afternoon in the Portland, Oregon airport, a man walked up to the counter of Northwest Orient Airlines. In those days, there were a lot more airlines. Over the years, most of them have been consolidated with the major airlines that exist in the U.S. today. This man asked if he could buy a ticket for the next flight to Seattle. The person behind the counter said yes, there were seats available, and that the price was $20. Imagine that, a flight for $20. $20 in 1971 would be worth somewhere around $160 in 2026. The man paid for the ticket in cash. Paying in cash was the norm in those days. In 1971, credit cards were not ubiquitous like they are now. Credit cards really became popular, at least here in the U.S., after the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. That law prohibited creditors from discriminating based upon race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, and age. One of the big results was that companies could no longer require a male cosigner for a woman to get a credit card. Yes, you heard me. Up until that time, most credit card companies would require a man to co-sign for a woman to get a credit card. Back to November 24, 1971. The man purchasing the ticket had to fill out his name, but he did not have to show any identification. This is how lax things were at the time. He did not need any ID to purchase the ticket or to get on the plane. He filled out the form and listed his name as Dan Cooper. This guy never referred to himself as D.B. Cooper. The reason he's now known as that is because when the story went viral, meaning in the newspapers and on TV and radio, somebody from the press mistakenly listed him as D.B. Cooper instead of Dan Cooper. And then the media ran with that name. And he's known to this day as D.B. Cooper, which I'm not sure why, kind of sounds cooler than Dan Cooper for such a mysterious person. Since that's how he is known throughout the world, I will refer to him as DB and not Dan. Cooper asked the Northwest Orient agent if the plane was a 727. He was told that it was. Now we have to talk a little bit about the Boeing 727 aircraft. Boeing started making the 727 in the early 1960s. They stopped making that aircraft in the 1980s. The most significant feature of the 727 was the fact that it had a descending rear staircase. Nowadays, we are used to getting onto and off of planes using portable walkways from the airliner to the terminal building. These devices seem to have several common names, including jet bridge or jetway. They started using these jetways in the late 1950s and early 1960s. As far as I could find, the first use of a jet bridge was at O'Hare Airport in Chicago in 1958. But jet bridges did not become standard equipment until the mid to late 1970s. Before jetways became common, if you were getting on an airplane, most of the time you had to walk out onto the tarmac and then climb a portable staircase to the door on the side of the airplane. The Boeing 727 eliminated the need for a portable staircase. The 727 had a built-in staircase that lowered from the back. People could board or disembark from a 727 by using that built-in staircase. The CIA discovered that this rear descending staircase could be utilized for clandestine airdrops. This was very convenient for dropping both cargo and personnel behind enemy lines during the Vietnam War. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, D.B. Cooper boarded Northwest Orient flight number 305 to Seattle. Cooper took his seat, which was either 18C or 18E. I've seen both listed. In any event, he was in row 18. Row 18 was the last row on the plane. He was wearing a dark suit with a white shirt and a black tie. He ordered a drink, bourbon and 7-Up. For a long time, 7-Up was an incredibly popular soda. It's a lemon-lime soda that started in the late 1920s. You don't see it very often now because it's very similar to Sprite, which started in the early 1960s, and because Sprite is part of the Coca-Cola company, it eventually crushed 7-Up. But in the early 1970s, 7-Up was the third most popular selling soda in the United States after Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Cooper was very polite and thanked the flight attendant for his mixed drink and paid with a $20 bill. Of course, in those days, nobody used the term flight attendant. They were called stewardesses. In the 1960s and 1970s, stewardesses were intentionally sexualized by the airlines. Stewardesses were hired based upon their looks. They could be fired if they gained weight. They were there to be leered at by the businessmen who made up such a large percentage of airline passengers in those days. And the airlines really promoted the stewardesses as sex objects. In the 1970s, Southwest Airlines advertised how their stewardesses wore hot pants. That's not a term you hear today, but it meant really short, tight-fitting shorts. And of course, the most infamous example of the sexualization of female flight attendants was the commercial campaign by national airlines. There were TV and print ads that would say, "Hi," and then they would say their name, "Fly me." Example, "Hi, I'm Jennifer, fly me." It was not very subtle. Of course, now we have male and female flight attendants, and the term stewardess went by the wayside around the late 1970s or early 1980s. Since then, we refer to these people as flight attendants, whether they are male or female, and that's how I will refer to the women working on Flight 305 that evening in 1971. There were 3 flight attendants on this particular flight. Alice Hancock worked in the first class section of the flight and had limited contact with D.B. Cooper. But Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow had a lot of interaction with him. These were very young women. Florence Schaffner was only 23 at the time of the D.B. Cooper incident, and Tina Mucklow was 22. After this incident, both of these women tried to stay out of the public limelight. Tina Mucklow once stated that her entire life was not defined by one day of interacting with D.B. Cooper. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper handed a note to Florence Schaffner. Since flight attendants in those days were used to men hitting on them all the time, she assumed it was just another come-on. She just stuck the note in her purse. Cooper got her attention and said, "Miss, I think you better read that note." He said it in a polite but serious fashion, so she read it. This is what it said. "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit beside me." She was stunned, but did as she was told. Cooper did not have any luggage with him that day other than the briefcase. He opened the briefcase to Florence Schaffner. She saw 6 or 8 red cylindrical sticks which had the general appearance of dynamite attached to some wires and a battery. Cooper told Florence that he wanted her to write down his demands. She did so and, pursuant to his instructions, took the demands to the captain. I could not find an exact word-for-word list, but here were his demands. Number 1, $200,000 in negotiable American currency in $20 bills. That was an awful lot of money in those days. $200,000 in 1971 would be worth approximately $1.6 million in 2026. Number 2, 4 parachutes. Specifically, 2 primary parachutes, the kind that go on your back, and 2 reserve parachutes, the kind that strap onto your front. Number 3, a knapsack to hold the money. Number 4, a fuel truck waiting at the airport in Seattle to refuel the aircraft immediately upon arrival. And he demanded that the plane be refueled in a secluded part of the airport. And he also warned in his list of demands, "No funny business or I'll do the job." After reading the note, the captain told Florence Schaffner to remain in the cockpit and take notes of everything that was going on. This left Tina Mucklow as the only flight attendant in the main cabin, so she became the person who dealt with Cooper for the rest of the skyjacking. At one point, Tina Mucklow asked Cooper why was he doing this? Did he have a grudge against the airline? He replied, "I don't have a grudge against your airline, miss. I just have a grudge." The captain radioed in Cooper's ultimatums. Northwest Airlines agreed to meet his demands. Requesting 4 parachutes was one of the smarter things that Cooper did. If he had just asked for 1 parachute, or even 1 regular parachute and 1 auxiliary, law enforcement might have given him parachutes which would not work, so he would plunge to his death. By asking for additional parachutes, the authorities thought that Cooper was planning on taking a hostage, or maybe more than 1 hostage, with him if he jumped out of the plane. For this reason, the parachutes that were supplied had to be fully functioning. Well, At least you would think so. By mistake, one of the 4 parachutes was a non-functional training parachute. It was a parachute that was used for classroom demonstrations so students could learn how to put it on, how to pull the ripcord without a parachute actually deploying. This training parachute was supplied by Error. It seems that the inoperable training parachute was one of the 2 that Cooper used when he jumped from the plane. From what I have read, the non-functioning parachute was the auxiliary chute which would be strapped to his chest. The functioning parachute was the main parachute on his back. So it makes you wonder, did he ever learn that the auxiliary chute was not functioning, that it was just a training article and would not have saved his life if he needed it? You have to remember that the authorities complying with the Skyjackers' demands were under a severe time crunch. It was reasonable that mistakes would be made. The inoperable training unit auxiliary parachute was simply a mistake and not done on purpose. The flight from Portland to Seattle would normally take approximately 35 to 45 minutes. This was not enough time to comply with the hijackers' demands. So the pilots circled in the air over the Seattle area until they were advised that Cooper's orders had been met. The passengers were never told that they were being skyjacked, so the pilots explained to the passengers that this was a simple maintenance problem that was causing the delay for landing in Seattle. When they landed in Seattle, Cooper ordered all of the window shades pulled down so people could not see inside the plane. He was worried about law enforcement sharpshooters. He allowed all of the passengers to get off the plane. When they got into the terminal, the passengers were interviewed by the FBI and later the news media. For those of you in other countries, FBI stands for Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's a nationwide high-end police force and investigative body. The passengers were surprised when they were approached by the FBI. This was the first time that they learned that they had been part of a skyjacking. Cooper required the cockpit staff to stay on board since they would have to fly the plane, but he allowed flight attendants Alice Hancock and Florence Schaffner to leave. He required flight attendant Tina Mucklow remain on board as his go-between. Ms. Mucklow was the one who brought the 4 parachutes and the knapsack full of money on board. Cooper was upset with the bag containing the money. There was no way to secure it to his body. He eventually opened one of the 4 parachutes and used a rope from that parachute to tie this bag to his body. Cooper examined the money and was satisfied that it was all there. Northwest Orient Airlines did supply the full $200,000. These serial numbers had been recorded in case any of this cash turned up. It could then be checked to see if it was part of the ransom money. All of this ransom cash was in $20 bills. Cooper demanded to be flown to Mexico City. The pilots explained that this plane could not carry enough fuel to reach Mexico City. They would have to stop along the way to refuel. It was agreed that they would stop in Reno, Nevada. Cooper had specific instructions about how the plane was to be flown. He demanded that the cabin remain unpressurized. He also insisted that the jet go no higher than 10,000 feet. That would be approximately 3,000 meters. Why was this? Because if the plane was above 10,000 feet, the cabin would have to be pressurized. When people are jumping out of airplanes, the cabin is not pressurized because if it was pressurized, it makes it very difficult or impossible to open the door and can cause a violent decompression from inside the cabin to outside. Cooper also specified that the wing flaps be kept at 15 degrees. This would make the plane remain stable at low speeds. The flaps are those parts on the back edge of the wings that go down when planes are taking off or landing. Cooper also instructed that the landing gear was to remain down throughout the flight. Normally, after takeoff, the landing gear is raised up into the plane. Although I have seen some different figures, it appears that Cooper demanded that the plane be kept at approximately 150 to 170 knots. That equals about 172 to 195 miles per hour, or 278 to 315 kilometers per hour. I've read different accounts as to the actual speed that the pilots actually flew the plane, but it was somewhere around 170 to 200 knots. That is very slow for a jetliner. His other demand was that the plane take off with the rear stairwell deployed. The pilots told Cooper that they could not ascend with the rear stairs open. The stairs would have to be closed for takeoff. Cooper said that was okay. The plane took off, headed for Reno, Nevada, to be refueled on the way to Mexico City. At some point, Cooper asked Tina Mucklow how to open the rear stairs. Now, this was surprising since Cooper seemed to know so much about the Boeing 727, yet he did not know how to deploy the rear stairs. Miss Mucklow showed him how to operate the stairs. Cooper then told her to go to the cockpit, which she did. The last thing she saw Cooper do was tie the money bag to his body with the rope from the parachute. An indicator in the cockpit told the pilots that the rear stairs had been lowered. The pilots could feel the turbulence from the large opening in the rear of the plane. At 8:13 p.m., the pilots felt a pressure bump in the rear of the plane. They guessed that the Skyjacker had jumped. The FBI used this guess as to when Cooper jumped to determine where he would have landed. We don't know exactly when or where Cooper jumped. The FBI and aviation authorities made an educated guess that it was somewhere over southwestern Washington state, just north of Portland, Oregon. Air Force jets tried to tail the Northwest Orient airliner. The problem was the commercial plane was going too slow for the military jets. If the pilots slowed down these Air Force planes to such a low speed, they would stall out. So the pilots zigzagged around in the air to try to keep near the commercial airliner, but they were unable to stay close. It's not exactly clear, but it appears that at least one helicopter was dispatched to follow the plane Cooper had hijacked. It seems that the helicopter was unable to stay close to the commercial jetliner. In any event, because of the darkness and the fact that it was a rainy night, the people in the helicopter and military planes did not see Cooper jump out of the plane. When the 727 landed in Reno, the FBI thoroughly checked the aircraft. Cooper was gone. They did not find the briefcase with the purported bomb. Either he took it with him or he threw it out when he jumped. The FBI asked for physical descriptions of D.B. Cooper from the flight crew and the passengers. Whenever you ask multiple people to describe somebody, you're going to have some differences. The descriptions were used for the 2 composite drawings you may have seen that were shown to the public and are now always shown whenever there's a video or story about D.B. Cooper. Here are the generally agreed upon descriptions of the hijacker. He was wearing a dark suit with a white shirt and a narrow black tie. The hijacker left his tie on the plane. It was a clip-on. The FBI thought that the tie might be a clue. They were able to determine that the tie was sold by JCPenney, a very large chain of retail stores, but they were unable to determine more than that. Cooper was a white man with short black hair. He was described as being around 6 feet tall. I don't know what the rest of the world uses to describe height since you don't use feet and inches. I'm presuming you just listed it as centimeters, so he would be approximately 182 centimeters tall. The witnesses described Cooper as having a fairly athletic build and approximately 170 to 175 pounds or 77 to 80 kilograms. His age was estimated to be in his mid-40s. Flight attendant Schaffner actually got to see his eyes that day. According to Florence Schaffner, Cooper had brown eyes. At some point during the flight, he put on the wraparound sunglasses that you see in one of the FBI composite drawings of him. That is why others did not get to see the color of his eyes. D.B. Cooper was smoking on the aircraft. During his time on board, he smoked either 7 or 8 cigarettes. 8 cigarette butts were found, but one of them may have been smoked by flight attendant Tina Mucklow. In those days, you could smoke on airplanes, and in those days, a lot more people smoked. According to the American Lung Association, in 1970, approximately 37% of American adults smoked tobacco, as compared to 2026, when it's down to approximately 11%. Fun fact, in 1970, Congress passed a law banning all cigarette commercials on radio and television effective January 2, 1971. That was a huge step by the federal government trying to reduce the amount of people smoking in America. Although earlier, in 1966, the federal government first required warnings on cigarette packs which stated, "Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health." Years later, the warnings on these cigarette packages became more strident and mentioned lung cancer. The FBI collected these 8 cigarette butts to determine if they could find any fingerprints. They could not. It appears that these cigarette butts were discarded at some point. Some people like to attribute nefarious reasons for this, but these things happen for 2 reasons. Number 1, mistakes happen. I know that sounds so simplistic, but it's true. We are dealing with human beings. Number 2, there did not seem to be any value in these stubs. Once it was determined that they could not lift fingerprints off of these cigarette butts, what was the point of keeping them? Yes, we certainly wish that the FBI now had these, since we might be able to obtain DNA evidence from the cigarette butts. But in the early 1970s, nobody in law enforcement had even heard of DNA. DNA became a law enforcement tool in the late 1980s and 1990s. Another missed opportunity was with the cup used for the bourbon and 7-Up. It's uncertain, but it appears that it was a plastic cup and not an actual glass. D.B. Cooper certainly left fingerprints on that plastic cup, but somehow this particular cup got mixed up with the other cups used by the other passengers on the plane. It's not quite clear how this happened. We're not sure if the FBI agents mixed up the cups, or if Cooper's cup had fallen while he was still on board, or while he was jumping out of the plane with all of that air turbulence in the cabin. We just don't know. Of course, even if the FBI was able to obtain Cooper's fingerprint off of the cup, it wouldn't be nearly as helpful as it is today. With the use of computers and national and international databases, a fingerprint can be scanned to determine if it belongs to anybody who's in the system. According to the FBI website, fingerprint identification began its transition to automation in the late 1960s using computers. But it's uncertain how easily they could identify a particular fingerprint in 1971. Mostly, fingerprints were used at that time to examine fingerprints found at the crime scene compared to the fingerprints from a particular suspect. It's not like today when they take fingerprints found at a crime scene, stick them in a computer, and find out if they match anybody whose fingerprints are already in the system. When you read about the D.B. Cooper case, people always point out that this skyjacking was so well planned. Cooper was certainly a pretty smart person and knew about commercial jets. This was evidenced by his selection of a Boeing 727 and his instructions to keep the plane under 10,000 feet of altitude and to keep the flaps down. But I've always questioned the fact that he did not take the weather into account. Number 1, he jumped out of a jetliner in late November in the Pacific Northwest. Since Portland was the closest big city to the location where we believe Cooper jumped, I looked up the weather for Portland. According to weatherunderground.com, the overnight low temperature that night was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. That would be approximately 6.5 degrees for you Celsius types. I find it amazing that I can look up online the weather for a particular day in 1971. The point is, it was very cold, and he had to have known that. Why didn't he do the skyjacking during the summer? We'll never know, but perhaps it was because he needed the money at that particular time and did not want to wait until late spring or summer. And added to the cold temperatures, it was raining when he jumped from the rear stairs of that 727. And in case you are not familiar with the weather in the Pacific Northwest, rain is a very common occurrence. According to weatherspark.com, the month with the most wet days in Portland, Oregon is November, with an average of 17 days with at least 0.04 inches of precipitation. So Cooper had to know that rain was a distinct possibility. Number 2, even if he was going to commit this skyjacking in late November, why didn't he have proper clothing? It is believed that he wore his suit so he would fit in as a supposed businessman traveling. That's fine. But in 1971, businessmen often had overcoats or trench coats to put on over their suits. Why didn't he bring a heavy coat? He also could have brought a carry-on suitcase with proper clothing and waterproof boots for when he made his jump. If he survived the jump and landed in the dense, wet forests of the Washington, Oregon region, I am sure he wished he had on a heavy coat and waterproof boots instead of dress shoes. The day after the hijacking, dozens of FBI agents and local law enforcement searched the forest where it was believed that Cooper would have landed. Most of the searches occurred around the town of Ariel, Washington, and Lake Merwin. Helicopters were used to scout from overhead, but their usefulness was limited because of the bad weather and the dense forest. Although they conducted extensive searches of the area, the FBI and other law enforcement personnel did not find any evidence regarding D.B. Cooper. If he died as a result of the jump, or if he died trying to get out of the forest, they presumed they would have found a body, some of his clothing, the parachute, something, but they did not find anything related to Cooper. Since November 1971, countless people outside of law enforcement have scoured the area hoping to find clues about D.B. Cooper and, more important, some of the money that he took with him when he jumped out of the plane. Some of Cooper's money was eventually found, and it was by accident. Before the bank released the $200,000, the serial numbers were recorded. Every bill of paper money in the United States has a unique serial number. On February 10, 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family on the Columbia River, approximately 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. This area is known as Tina Bar. Brian was digging in the sandy riverbank. It's a little unclear, but it seems that he was digging a pit because his family was going to build a campfire. Brian found 3 packets of cash. They were all $20 bills and had rubber bands around each of the 3 bundles. The bills were in pretty bad shape and were somewhat disintegrated. The 3 stacks of $20 bills totaled $5,800. The Ingram family turned the money over to the FBI. The serial numbers were checked, and it was confirmed that this money was part of the $200,000 ransom paid to D.B. Cooper. No other bills that were given to Cooper have ever been discovered, and none have been found in general circulation. The finding of the $5,800 has raised more questions than it's answered. How did the money get there? Tina Bar is approximately 20 miles or 32 kilometers away from the town of Ariel, Washington, where the FBI estimated D.B. Cooper jumped out of the plane. Some people have speculated that the money washed down some smaller river and then into the Columbia River. But this seems unlikely because if he did land somewhere around Ariel, Washington, the nearest river was the Lewis River. If the money floated down the Lewis River to the Columbia, the money would reach the Columbia across from St. Helens, Oregon. Why is that significant? Because that location is downriver from Tina Bar, where Brian Ingram found the money. That would imply that the Cooper money floated upstream against the current of the Columbia River to reach Tina Bar. Obviously, that's an impossibility. After all of these years of investigations by the FBI, as well as many citizen sleuths, nobody has been able to figure out how the money got there. Some have speculated that Cooper buried it at Tina Bar along the Columbia River, but why would he do that? And why would he just bury 5,800? And why hasn't more been found? For their investigation, the FBI worked up a profile of the man known as D.B. Cooper. They thought he might have been ex-military since he was not afraid to jump out of a plane in a rainstorm at night into a dense forest in November in the Pacific Northwest. They also thought he might have worked for an airline or maybe an aircraft manufacturer like Boeing, since he seemed to know a lot about airplanes. It was thought that Cooper was either from the Washington, Oregon area or was at least very familiar with it. The FBI interviewed hundreds of people and tracked down leads across the United States. Based upon the physical description in their profile, the FBI investigated a lot of potential suspects. According to the FBI website, by the 5-year anniversary of the Skyjacking, the FBI had considered more than 800 suspects. They eliminated all but 24 from consideration. They closely examined the approximately 24 suspects that seemed promising, but eventually the FBI rejected all of them for one reason or another. If you go online, you will find many people who claim that they have solved this case and they know the true identity of D.B. Cooper. Not true. People focus on certain suspects, but those suspects have been investigated by the FBI, who has rejected those individuals as being D.B. Cooper. What about the people who have confessed? Several people have claimed to be the infamous hijacker. So what? For many psychological reasons, people often confess to high-profile crimes. I kind of get the appeal of claiming to be D.B. Cooper. For a criminal, he has a very cool image, but you have to keep in mind that sometimes people confess to committing heinous crimes. Although I could not find a specific number, several people confessed to the police that they were the infamous serial killer known as the Zodiac, who killed several people in the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Why would anybody claim to be a serial killer? I don't know, but for some reason, people just like to confess to famous crimes. One of the names that pops up online when people allege that they have solved the D.B. Cooper case is a man named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. On April 7, 1972, McCoy boarded United Airlines flight number 855. The flight originated in Newark, New Jersey, and was going to Los Angeles with a stopover in Denver. McCoy got on in Denver. He gave his name as James Johnson. As I explained earlier, you did not need to show any ID in those days. Just like the D.B. Cooper case, the plane was a Boeing 727 with the rear staircase built into the plane. At some point during the flight, McCoy showed that he was armed with a pistol and a hand grenade. I don't know why, but I find that last fact to be amazing. He didn't have a bomb, he had a hand grenade. He had an envelope with his hijack instructions. One of the flight attendants gave the envelope to the pilot. McCoy demanded $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. Even though the flight was scheduled to land in Los Angeles, McCoy demanded that they land in San Francisco. Once they landed, his demands were met, and the plane took off heading eastbound. It's unclear whether he gave a specific destination, but somewhere over the state of Utah, McCoy jumped from the rear stairs, just like D.B. Cooper had done 5 months earlier. But Richard McCoy was caught. How? According to the FBI website, the Salt Lake City office of the FBI received a telephone call the day after the skyjacking. The caller said that they knew somebody who had outlined a foolproof plan for hijacking an airplane. The caller said that the acquaintance was named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. Think about this. He was caught because he was bragging before he committed the crime. So, who was this guy McCoy? He was a Vietnam veteran, a helicopter pilot, and an avid skydiver. The FBI interviewed McCoy. Of course, he denied it. They evaluated samples of his handwriting. Although McCoy's original hijacking demands were typewritten, throughout the flight, he handwrote some additional notes. The FBI compared the handwriting on at least one of those notes to an actual handwriting sample from McCoy, and they were a match. Further, there were fingerprints left on the airline's in-flight magazine where McCoy had been seated. In those days, airlines provided their own magazines, which mostly advertised places to go and things to buy. The fingerprints on the magazine were compared to McCoy's fingerprints, and they were a match. McCoy was arrested on April 9, which was only 2 days after the skyjacking. A couple of months later, he was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison. But this was not the end of the Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. saga. No, on August 10, 1974, he escaped from the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. According to the New York Times article I found from the following day, McCoy and 3 other inmates commandeered a garbage truck to break out of the federal prison. McCoy was caught 3 months later. On November 9, 1974, McCoy died in a shootout with FBI agents as they were trying to capture him. Because several details of the 2 crimes were similar, some people have argued that McCoy was D.B. Cooper. The FBI has rejected it because he did not fit the physical description. Cooper was described as being in his mid-40s, and McCoy was only 29 years old in 1972. Cooper had brown eyes, and McCoy had blue eyes. And flight attendants Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow, as well as Bill Mitchell, one of the passengers who was sitting across from Cooper and got a good look at him, looked at photographs of McCoy, and they all agreed that he definitely was not D.B. Cooper. One other thing, the reason McCoy got caught was because he was bragging about how he could commit the perfect skyjacking. If he was D.B. Cooper, he already did commit the perfect skyjacking. He wouldn't be bragging to somebody that he was going to do it. I'm not sure why people think that the similarities between the 2 skyjackings mean it was the same person. By April of 1972, the details of the D.B. Cooper skyjacking were known throughout the U.S. and the world. I'm guessing that a lot of people got the idea that this was an easy way to make a large sum of money. It seems that McCoy was simply a copycat. There is an odd coincidence in the alias that the hijacker used on November 24, 1971. As I explained earlier, he listed his name as Dan Cooper. Starting in the 1950s, there was a comic book series called Dan Cooper. It was sold in France, Belgium, and the Canadian province of Quebec. It was primarily published in French, and it appears that it was never officially distributed in the United States. The comic book was about a fictional Canadian military man named Dan Cooper. Dan Cooper, in the comic books, was a test pilot and an astronaut. One of the comic book covers showed Dan Cooper parachuting out of a jet plane. My opinion is it's just a coincidence, but some have speculated that the 1971 Skyjacker used the name because he was a fan of the comic book. I doubt it because everybody who dealt with Cooper on the day and evening of the Skyjacking said he did not have an accent. He sounded American, he did not sound like French was his first language. Also, we are talking about very common names. I don't know how accurate this is, but one source I found online stated that in the year 2000 census, there were over 270,000 people with the last name of Cooper in the U.S. If that's anywhere close to being accurate, you have to presume that there were several Dans or Daniels in there. My guess is that he picked the name Dan Cooper because it sounded like a very common American name. Since the comic books were not sold in the U.S., some speculated that the Skyjacker might have been French-Canadian who did not have an accent when he spoke English. Or maybe he had lived for a while in France or Belgium. Who knows? I don't think it leads to anything. It just seems like a little oddity in a very strange case. So why is D.B. Cooper so revered? He was a criminal. Yet from the time he skyjacked Flight 305 through today, a lot of people admire him. I think there are several factors. Number one, he's never been caught or even identified. This gives him an air of mystery. Number two, nobody was hurt in the skyjacking. Number three, the flight attendants and everybody who dealt with him said he was polite. He called the flight attendants Miss, a polite way of addressing young women in those days, and he even said thank you. Number four, he committed his crime in 1971. This was at a time when so many Americans were disillusioned. They were anti-establishment. Here was a guy who stuck it to the man and got away with it. Good for him. It gave him this kind of Robin Hood image. Of course, he may have stolen from the rich, but as far as we know, he did not give anything to the poor. I could not find any actual formal polls taken on the popularity of D.B. Cooper, but within a few weeks after the skyjacking, people were selling t-shirts which said, D.B. Cooper, where are you? There have been many documentaries, books, and videos about this case. Cooper is mentioned in several songs. There are locations in the Pacific Northwest which have regular D.B. Cooper-themed events. He was never caught and his body was never found. Did he die when he jumped out of the plane? If he did, you would think that someone would have found some evidence, like his body, part of his clothing, or the parachute, or something. Did he survive and then lead a quiet life? At this point, it seems that we may never know who D.B. Cooper really was. To this day, it's the only skyjacking in U.S. history which has never been solved. That is why he still captures the public imagination 55 years after his daring skyjacking. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. If you are listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I'd greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. Spotify does not allow reviews for an entire podcast. However, you can comment and review a particular episode. So, of course, I would appreciate any kind words and a review of this episode on Spotify. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to leave a review. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Please tell your friends, relatives, and coworkers word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all the history geeks out there. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.